The scent of rain and wilting roses hung heavy in the air, a funereal perfume that had clung to their small house for the 3 months since her mother's funeral. Harper Caldwell gently placed a cup of tea in front of her father, his hands trembling as he reached for it. He hadn't been the same since Mom was gone. The grief had hollowed him out, leaving behind a man made of glass, ready to shatter at the slightest touch. "Dad," she said softly, her voice full of a concern that had become a constant ache in her chest. "You haven't eaten all day. Let me make you something." "I can't," he whispered, his eyes wide with a terror that went far beyond grief. He looked at her, and the facade of the grieving widower finally crumbled, revealing the terrified, broken man beneath. "Harper, I've done something terrible." A cold knot of dread tightened in her stomach. "What is it?" "What's wrong?" "The hospital bills," he began, his voice cracking. "After your mother. The costs were astronomical. The insurance barely covered anything. I was drowning, Harper. I was desperate." He took a ragged breath. "I borrowed money. From a man I shouldn't have gone near." "What man?" she asked, though a part of her already knew. The whispers she'd heard, the black cars that sometimes parked at the end of their quiet street. It was all starting to make a terrifying kind of sense. "They call him the Ghost," her father choked out. "Jacob, the head of the city's underworld. I thought I could pay it back quickly, that I could secure a new business deal, but everything fell through." "How much, Dad?" she asked, her voice barely audible. He wouldn't meet her eyes. "Too much. He came to collect yesterday. I told him I had nothing left to give." "So what happens now?" she whispered, picturing men in dark suits breaking down their door. He made a proposal," her father stammered, his face ashen. "A solution. He said he would forgive the entire debt, that we would be safe, under his protection." A sliver of hope pierced through her fear. "What's the solution? What does he want?" Her father finally looked at her, and his eyes were filled with a shame so profound, it was like a physical blow. "He wants you," he whispered. "He wants you to marry him." The world tilted. The teacup slipped from her father's trembling hands and shattered on the floor, the sound unnaturally loud in the sudden, suffocating silence. "No," Harper breathed, shaking her head in disbelief. "No, that's insane. I won't do it. I would rather die." "Harper!" Her father lunged forward, grabbing her by the shoulders, his grip surprisingly strong. The gentle, grieving man was gone, replaced by someone she didn't recognize, someone wild with a terror she couldn't comprehend. "You don't understand. This isn't a choice. It's not about the money anymore. It's about our survival." The raw, primal fear in his eyes was what broke her. This was more than a debt. This was a threat, a danger so immense that her strong, proud father was willing to sacrifice his own daughter to escape it. She was being sold, not just to settle a debt, but to buy their lives. She looked at her father's desperate face, at the home that was about to be ripped away, at the memory of her mother that she was so desperately trying to hold on to. And she knew she had no choice. She was trapped, betrayed by her own father, sentenced to a life with a monster. A cold, hard resolve settled over her, extinguishing her fear and leaving only a burning, icy rage in its place. If she had to be a sacrifice, she would not go like a lamb to the slaughter. She pulled away from her father's grasp, her expression hardening into a mask of stone. "All right," she said, her voice devoid of all emotion. "I'll do it." She met his gaze, her eyes as cold and dead as her heart now felt. "I'll marry the monster." The wedding was a sterile 10-minute affair in a drab, wood-paneled municipal office. There were no flowers, no music, no guests, save for her father, who looked like a man attending his own execution, and 2 of Jacob's men who stood by the door like stone gargoyles. Harper wore a simple white dress she had owned for years. It felt less like a wedding gown and more like a shroud. Jacob stood beside her, a silent, imposing presence in a perfectly tailored dark suit. He was younger than she had imagined, perhaps in his early 30s, with sharp, intelligent features, dark hair, and eyes so deep and calm they seemed to absorb all the light in the room. He didn't look like a monster. He looked like a predator, coiled and patient, his power a quiet, confident hum beneath the surface. He had not spoken a single word to her. When the justice of the peace, a man who studiously avoided making eye contact with anyone, mumbled, "You may kiss the bride," a tense silence fell. Jacob didn't move. He simply looked at her, his expression unreadable, before turning back to the justice. "That won't be necessary." The quiet dismissal was more humiliating than any public display could have been. It was a clear, cold statement. This was a transaction, not a marriage. After signing the papers that officially bound her life to his, he turned to her. He didn't take her arm. He simply extended a hand, his palm open. "Let's go," he said, his voice a low, even baritone. It was the first time he had spoken directly to her, and the sound sent an involuntary shiver down her spine. She ignored his hand and walked out of the office on her own. He led her to a sleek black car and drove them to his home. It wasn't a home, it was a fortress. A modern architectural masterpiece of glass, steel, and concrete. It was perched on a cliff overlooking the city, surrounded by high walls and an imposing gate. It was beautiful, cold, and utterly impenetrable. Inside, the house was just as impersonal. The decor was minimalist, the colors muted, the surfaces gleaming and empty. It felt like a luxury hotel no one had ever checked into. "This will be your room," he said, leading her to a large, beautifully appointed suite with a panoramic view of the city. A walk-in closet was already filled with new clothes in her size, a silent, presumptuous intrusion. "My wing is on the other side of the house. You will have everything you need here." He paused at the door, his hand on the frame. "Do not try to leave the property. It is not safe." The words were spoken with the same calm, flat tone he used for everything, but they carried the unmistakable weight of a command. That night, sleep was impossible. Harper felt like a ghost haunting the edges of her own life. Driven by a desperate, restless energy, she began to explore her gilded cage. She tested the windows, reinforced, checked the doors, all locked from the outside, and noted the discreet security cameras in the hallways. She was a prisoner. Her search eventually led her to a door she hadn't noticed before. It opened into a vast, two-story library. It was the only room in the house that felt lived in. Thousands of books lined the walls from floor to ceiling, the air thick with the scent of old paper and leather. Unlike the rest of the house, this room was a reflection of a mind, not just a bank account. She ran her fingers along the spines, her eyes scanning the titles. There were classics, philosophy, poetry. But what caught her attention was an entire section devoted to history, military strategy, and biographies of great leaders and tacticians. Sun Tzu's The Art of War, Machiavelli's The Prince, the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius. It was the collection of a scholar, a strategist, a man who understood power on a level far beyond mere brute force. It was the library of a king, not a thug. She was so engrossed that she didn't hear him enter. "Do you like to read?" She jumped, spinning around to find him standing in the doorway, watching her. He wasn't angry that she was in his private space. His expression was, as always, unreadable. "It's a good pastime," he continued, his voice a low, calm murmur that was somehow more unnerving than any threat. "It keeps the mind occupied." He walked past her to a shelf, pulled out a worn, leather-bound book, and settled into a large armchair in the corner, leaving her standing in the middle of the room. He opened the book and began to read, completely ignoring her, as if she were nothing more than a piece of furniture. His quiet, unnerving tranquility was a form of psychological warfare. He wasn't treating her like a prisoner to be broken, but like an object to be stored. And in that moment, Harper knew that escaping his fortress would be far more complicated than just finding an unlocked door. She would have to understand the mind of the man who had built it. The next morning, a sleek, new smartphone sat on the breakfast table beside her plate. When she picked it up, it was already on, the screen displaying a single new contact. Jacob. He walked into the dining room as she was examining it. That is your only means of communication with the outside world, he said, his voice as cool and crisp as the morning air. He sat down at the opposite end of the long, polished table, a chasm of wood and silence between them. Your family's numbers are pre-programmed. All calls and messages are monitored for your safety. The word safety echoed in her mind, sounding more and more like the bars of a cage. The days that followed fell into a strange, surreal routine. Jacob was a phantom in his own house. He would be gone before she woke up, leaving only the lingering scent of expensive coffee in the air. He would return late at night, long after she had eaten her solitary dinner, and retreat to his study or the library. They were two ghosts haunting the same magnificent empty space. He never forced her to do anything. He never touched her. He rarely even spoke to her. His indifference was a unique and maddening form of torture. She was his wife, but she felt more like a rare, valuable painting he had acquired and hung in a forgotten hallway, an object to be owned but not engaged with. She was a ghost in her own life, and the silence of the mansion was a constant, screaming reminder of her captivity. She spent her days in the library, devouring books, trying to piece together the puzzle of the man she had married. She read about history, about strategy, about the rise and fall of empires. She was trying to understand his mind, to find a weakness, a crack in his impenetrable armor. One sunny afternoon, she was in the garden, a sprawling, manicured space that felt like another beautiful room of her prison. One of Jacob's men, a younger guard named Leo with a kind face and friendly eyes, was stationed nearby. Seeing her sitting alone, he hesitantly approached. "It's a beautiful day, Mrs. Donovan," he said, his voice respectful. "The roses are looking particularly nice this week." Harper, starved for any kind of normal human interaction, gave him a small, grateful smile. "They are. I didn't realize they grew so well here." They fell into a simple, easy conversation about gardening. For a few precious minutes, Harper felt like a person again, not just a possession. And then, the temperature seemed to drop. Jacob had appeared from nowhere, standing silently on the terrace, watching them. He said nothing. He did nothing. He simply stared at Leo, his expression completely blank, his stillness more menacing than any overt threat. Leo paled. The friendly warmth in his eyes vanished, replaced by a stark professional fear. "I have to get back to my post," he stammered, before turning and walking away so quickly it was almost a run. Jacob then turned his gaze to Harper. She braced herself for a reprimand, for a cold reminder of her place. But he just looked at her for a long moment before speaking. "He won't harm you," Jacob said, his voice a low, even murmur. "No one here will harm you." "I gave my word." The statement was so unexpected it left her momentarily speechless. A spark of defiance ignited in her chest. "Your word?" she retorted, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "To whom? My father? The man you blackmailed into selling his own daughter?" He walked down the steps from the terrace and stopped a few feet from her. His calm, unreadable gaze met her fiery one. "To someone who matters," he replied, his voice quiet and enigmatic. He then turned and walked back into the house, leaving her standing alone in the garden, the scent of roses suddenly cloying. "To someone who matters." The phrase echoed in her mind, a key to a lock she didn't understand. It wasn't an answer. It was just another question, another piece of the maddening puzzle of Jacob, the ghost. And it only deepened the unsettling feeling that her gilded cage was far more complex, and its purpose far more mysterious than she had ever imagined. A week into her new life, Jacob informed her, with his usual lack of ceremony, that they would be attending a high-profile charity gala. "You are my wife," he stated, as if explaining a simple, unchangeable fact of nature. "It is expected that you will be by my side." The words were a cold reminder of her role. She was a prop, a piece of his public persona. The night of the gala, she stood before the mirror in a stunning, midnight blue gown that had been provided for her. It was a beautiful dress, but it felt like a costume for a part she never wanted to play. The event was held in a grand ballroom, dripping with crystal and old money. The moment they entered, a hush fell over the room, followed by a wave of excited, curious whispers. Harper felt hundreds of eyes on her, dissecting her, speculating. She was the ghost's wife, the mysterious woman who had suddenly appeared on the arm of the city's most powerful and feared man. Jacob seemed oblivious to the attention. He guided her through the room with a firm but impersonal hand on the small of her back. The touch was not intimate. It was a gesture of ownership, a clear, silent signal to the entire room. "Who is she?" "I heard his father had to sell her to him to cover a debt. She's beautiful, but she looks terrified." The whispers followed them like a cloud of biting insects. Harper held her head high, her face a mask of calm indifference, but inside, she was trembling. The true test came later in the evening. Jacob was pulled into a conversation with a group of stern-faced men, leaving her momentarily alone near the bar. A man she recognized as a notoriously brash and arrogant real estate developer, Richard Thorne, swaggered over to her, a half-empty glass of whiskey in his hand. "Well, well," Thorne slurred, his eyes raking over her with a lecherous grin. "You must be the ghost's latest acquisition. Tell me, what's the going rate for a pretty thing like you these days? I heard your father's company went under. A desperate sale, was it?" The insult was so crude, so public, that it stole her breath. Her face burned with humiliation. She opened her mouth to deliver a scathing retort, but before she could utter a word, a sudden chill fell over their small group. Jacob had materialized beside her, moving with a silent, predatory grace. He didn't look at Thorne, he looked at Harper. He subtly shifted his body, creating a physical barrier between her and the other man. "I believe you've had too much to drink to continue having a civilized conversation, Richard," Jacob said, his voice dangerously low, a blade of steel wrapped in velvet. "I suggest you retire for the evening." Thorne, who had built his career on bluster and intimidation, seemed to shrink under Jacob's cold, quiet gaze. The drunken bravado evaporated from his face, replaced by a sudden, stark sobriety. He stammered a hasty apology and practically fled. Jacob then turned to her, his dark eyes scanning her face, his expression unreadable but for a flicker of something in their depths. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice losing its threatening edge, becoming something softer, something almost gentle. The genuine concern in his question caught her completely off guard. She had expected him to be angry at her for causing a scene, for being a liability. But he wasn't. He was concerned. For her. "I'm fine," she managed to whisper, her heart hammering against her ribs. For the first time since she had met him, she saw something beyond the cold, calculating Mafia boss. She saw a protector, and the realization was more confusing and more frightening than his indifference had ever been. He was a monster, she reminded herself. But tonight, he had been her monster. The incident at the gala left Harper deeply unsettled. Jacob's fierce, quiet protection was a confusing counterpoint to his cold indifference at home. He was a man of contradictions, a puzzle she was no closer to solving. Driven by a new, more urgent need to understand, she began to explore the mansion with a different purpose. She was no longer just looking for an escape route, she was looking for answers. Her search led her to his private study, a room she had previously avoided. It was as immaculate and controlled as the rest of the house, but more personal. One wall was a map of the city, marked with intricate coded notations. But it was a small, unassuming box on a lower shelf of his bookshelf that drew her eye. It was a simple wooden box, out of place amongst the leather-bound first editions. Her hands trembling, she opened it. Inside, nestled amongst old medals and a faded pocket watch, was a small stack of black and white photographs. The first few were of a young, smiling couple she didn't recognize. But then she pulled out a photo that made her heart stop. It was a picture of two men, their arms slung around each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera. They were young, full of life. One was a man with kind eyes and a familiar smile, her grandfather, a man she had adored, who had passed away when she was a teenager. The other man, handsome and laughing, she recognized from the other photos in the box. She was still staring at the photograph, her mind reeling, when Jacob walked into the room. He stopped when he saw her, his eyes immediately falling to the open box and the picture in her hand. For the first time, she saw his composure crack. A flicker of something. Pain, nostalgia, regret crossed his face before his mask of cool indifference slammed back into place. "Who is this?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, holding up the photograph. He walked over to his desk, not looking at her. He hesitated for a long moment before answering. "That is my grandfather," he said, his voice flat. "And yours." The confirmation hit her like a physical blow. They knew each other? "They were best friends," Jacob said, his voice quiet. "They grew up together, fought in the war together. They were brothers, in all but blood." The information was a seismic shock, rearranging the entire landscape of her understanding. If their families were so deeply connected, then this wasn't just a random cruel transaction. It was personal. "Then why?" she asked, her voice breaking, the photograph trembling in her hand. "If our families were friends, why would you do this to mine? Why destroy us?" He finally turned to look at her, his eyes as cold and hard as granite. "Business is business, Harper," he said, the words sounding hollow, rehearsed. "Debts don't respect old friendships." But it was a lie. She could feel it. The answer was too simple, too clean. It didn't explain the pain she had seen in his eyes when he saw the photograph. It didn't explain the fierce, protective anger at the gala. It didn't explain the library full of strategy books or the quiet sadness that seemed to cling to him like a second skin. "I don't believe you," she said, her voice gaining a new strength. He simply stared at her, his expression unreadable once more. "You can believe what you want," he said, before turning his attention to some papers on his desk, a clear, cold dismissal. She left his study, the photograph still clutched in her hand. The lie he had told was more revealing than any truth could have been. He was hiding something. The idea that he was punishing her family for a simple debt was no longer just unlikely. It was impossible. There was a deeper story here, a connection between their families that went far beyond money. And for the first time she felt a flicker of something other than fear or hatred for the man she had married. She felt a profound, burning curiosity. The monster had a past, and she was beginning to realize that his past was inextricably linked with her own. The discovery of the photograph haunted Harper's nights. The puzzle of Jacob, of their family's intertwined past, and the lie he had told her, consumed her thoughts. Sleep, when it came, was shallow and filled with anxious dreams. One night, the anxiety coalesced into a full-blown nightmare. She was running down a dark, unfamiliar street, the cobblestones slick with rain. The air was thick with a chilling fog, and the streetlights cast long, distorted shadows that seemed to writhe and reach for her. She could hear footsteps behind her, heavy and relentless, getting closer and closer. She didn't dare look back. She knew with a certainty that filled her with icy terror that a faceless man was chasing her, his intentions violent and absolute. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. Her legs felt like lead, her lungs burned. The footsteps were right behind her now. A hand reached out, grabbing her shoulder. Harper woke up with a strangled scream, sitting bolt upright in her bed, her body drenched in a cold sweat, her heart hammering against her ribs as if trying to escape her chest. The room was dark, but the terror of the dream was still vividly real. Before she could even catch her breath, her bedroom door burst open. Jacob stood there, silhouetted against the dim light of the hallway. He was wearing only a pair of dark pajama pants, his bare chest and shoulders defined and powerful in the shadows. He was holding a gun, held low at his side, his entire body coiled with a lethal readiness. "What is it?" he demanded, his voice a low, urgent growl as his eyes swept the room, searching for a threat. "What happened?" It was nothing," she stammered, clutching the silk sheets to her chest, suddenly aware of her own thin nightgown. A nightmare. Just a bad dream. He visibly relaxed, the tension draining from his shoulders. He lowered the gun, placing it on her dresser with a quiet, heavy click. He looked at her pale face, and the genuine terror still lingering in her eyes. "It was just a dream," he said, his voice softening, losing its hard, dangerous edge. He took a hesitant step into the room. "You're safe here." He sat down on the edge of her bed, a respectable distance away, but his presence still filled the room, overwhelming her senses. He smelled of sleep and clean linen and something uniquely, masculinely his. "Do you want to talk about it?" he asked, his voice surprisingly gentle. She shook her head, unable to speak. She wrapped her arms around her knees, trying to stop the trembling that racked her body. He was silent for a long moment, simply watching her. Then, with a hesitation she had never seen in him before, he reached out. His hand moved slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. He gently brushed a damp strand of hair from her forehead, his fingers light and warm against her cold skin. The touch was a shock, a spark of warmth in the cold terror of the night. It was not the touch of a captor or a husband in name only. It was a simple, human gesture of comfort, and it undid her completely. A sob escaped her lips, and she couldn't stop the tears that followed. He didn't pull his hand away. He let it rest on her hair, his thumb beginning to stroke her temple in a slow, soothing rhythm. They sat there in the quiet darkness, the only sound her ragged breathing and the soft, rhythmic caress of his thumb against her skin. The tension in the room shifted, the space between them crackling with a new, different kind of energy. It was an intimacy so profound, so unexpected, it was almost painful. She looked up at him through her tears, and in the dim moonlight filtering through the window, she could see the conflict in his eyes. He was the ghost, the ruthless Mafia boss, a man who dealt in power and violence. But the man sitting on her bed, offering her quiet comfort in the middle of the night, was someone else entirely. "I won't let anything happen to you, Harper," he whispered, and the words sounded less like a statement and more like a sacred, unbreakable vow. He held her gaze for another long, heart-stopping moment, his thumb never ceasing its gentle, hypnotic motion. Then, as if realizing he had crossed a line he had set for himself, he slowly withdrew his hand. The loss of his touch was an ache. He stood up. "Try to get some sleep," he said, his voice once again carefully neutral. He walked to the door and left, closing it softly behind him. Harper lay back against her pillows, her heart pounding a wild, chaotic rhythm. Her skin still tingled where he had touched her. She was confused, terrified, and utterly bewildered by her own body's reaction to his proximity, to his unexpected tenderness. The monster had shown her comfort, and she had craved more. The memory of his touch, of his quiet, unexpected comfort in the dead of night, became a ghost that haunted Harper's waking hours. It was a dangerous memory, one that threatened to soften the edges of her hatred, to complicate the simple narrative of captor and captive she had clung to for survival. She tried to push it away, to focus on the cold reality of her situation. She was a prisoner, and he was her jailer. Nothing had changed, but something had changed. A subtle shift had occurred in the atmosphere of the house. The silence between them was no longer just empty space. It was now filled with the unspoken memory of that shared vulnerability. She found his eyes lingering on her more often across the dining table, a flicker of something unreadable in their depths before he would look away. He started leaving books on the table in the library that he thought she might enjoy, a collection of poetry, a biography of a female artist. They were small, silent gestures, acknowledgments of her existence that were more unnerving than his previous indifference. She knew she needed to see her father. She needed to look him in the eye and demand the real story. The lie about the debt was a gaping hole in her understanding, and the fear she had seen in him felt more real and pressing than ever. She approached Jacob in his study, her heart pounding with a familiar mixture of fear and defiance. "I want to see my father," she said, her voice firm. He looked up from his papers, his expression, as always, neutral. He considered her for a moment. "All right," he said, to her surprise. "I'll arrange it, but you will not go alone. 2 of my men will go with you. They will not leave your side. It's not negotiable." The "for your safety" was left unsaid, but it hung in the air between them. 2 days later, a black sedan, flanked by another car, drove her back to the small, quiet neighborhood she had once called home. The house looked even smaller, more fragile than she remembered. Leo, the young guard with the kind eyes, and another, older, more grim-faced man named Marcus, escorted her to the door. Her father opened it, and the change in him was shocking. The terrified but still proud man who had sent her away was gone. The man who stood before her now was a ghost, his eyes wide with a constant, frantic terror. He looked haunted. "Harper," he breathed, pulling her inside and immediately closing and locking the door. "You shouldn't have come. It's not safe." "I had to see you, Dad," she said, her heart aching at the sight of him. "You have to tell me the truth. What is really going on? Who is this man you're so afraid of?" "You don't understand the danger," he whispered, pacing the small living room like a caged animal. "He's out. He's been looking for me. For you." "Who, Dad? Who is out?" "An old enemy," he choked out. "From before you were born. A business deal gone wrong. He blamed me for his ruin, for his prison sentence. He swore he would take everything from me. When your mother died, he saw his chance. He knew I was broken. He knew you were all I had left." The pieces began to click into place, forming a picture far more terrifying than a simple debt. "He wants to hurt you, Harper," her father sobbed, his composure finally breaking. "To destroy you, to make me watch. That's his revenge." He grabbed her arms, his eyes wild. "That's why I went to Jacob, his grandfather. He was my friend. He was an honorable man. I knew his grandson was the only one powerful enough, ruthless enough to keep you safe. Marrying you was the only way he could justify putting his entire organization on the line to protect you. It was the only way to make you his, to put you under his shield. You have to obey him, Harper. Please. Don't try to run. It's the only way you'll survive." The truth was a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. Her father hadn't sold her. He had saved her. He had sacrificed her freedom for her life, making a deal with one monster to protect her from another. The drive back to the mansion was a blur. Her mind was reeling, trying to process the new reality. Her hatred for Jacob, the solid ground she had stood on for weeks, had crumbled away, leaving her in a free fall of confusion and a dawning, horrified understanding. They were about 10 minutes from the estate, driving down a quiet, tree-lined road, when it happened. A large black truck, seemingly from out of nowhere, slammed into the side of their car with a deafening screech of metal on metal. The force of the impact was brutal, throwing Harper violently against the door. The world spun, a kaleidoscope of shattering glass and twisted steel. Before she could even register what had happened, the back door was wrenched open. Leo, his face a mask of grim determination, was already pulling her out, shielding her with his own body. "Marcus, cover us," he yelled. Another car had screeched to a halt behind them, blocking the road. Men in dark clothes were piling out, guns raised. The sharp, terrifying crack of gunfire erupted, a sound so loud it vibrated through her bones. Leo shoved her behind the relative safety of their wrecked car. "Stay down, Mrs. Donovan," he commanded, drawing his own weapon. The next few minutes were a chaotic, terrifying blur of noise and violence. It was a professional, coordinated ambush. These were not common thugs. They were hunters. Harper huddled behind the car, her heart pounding in her ears, her mind numb with terror. She saw Marcus, the older guard, take a bullet to the shoulder, grunting in pain but never faltering, returning fire with a steady hand. She saw Leo move with a deadly efficiency, a trained soldier in a street war. Then she heard the roar of another engine. Jacob's backup car, which had been following at a distance, came tearing around the corner, its tires screaming. 2 more of his men jumped out, joining the firefight, turning the tide. The attackers, suddenly outgunned, scrambled back to their vehicle and sped away, leaving behind a scene of smoking wreckage and shell casings. In the sudden ringing silence, Leo rushed to her side. "Are you all right, Mom? Are you hurt?" She could only shake her head, her body trembling uncontrollably. The threat her father had spoken of, The faceless man from her nightmares was real, and he had just tried to kill her. The ride back to the mansion in the backup car was silent. When they pulled through the gates, Jacob was waiting for them on the steps. He wasn't wearing a suit. He was in dark jeans and a t-shirt, and he looked more dangerous and imposing than he ever had in his expensive armor. His eyes, usually so calm and unreadable, were blazing with a cold, terrifying fury. He ignored his men. He ignored the damage. His gaze was locked on Harper. He strode to the car, pulled open the door, and his eyes swept over her, checking for any sign of injury. "They found you," he said, his voice a low, guttural growl that was nothing like his usual calm murmur. The quiet control was gone, replaced by a raw, primal rage. I underestimated him. He reached in and gently, almost reverently, helped her out of the car. His hands were warm and steady on her arms. He looked at her pale, shocked face, at the terror still lingering in her eyes, and the fury in his own seemed to intensify. It was not the anger of a boss whose property had been damaged. It was the rage of a man whose most precious possession had been threatened. He looked from her to his injured men, his jaw tight. "Get Marcus to the doctor, now," he commanded. He then turned his gaze back to Harper, his expression hardening into a mask of cold, lethal determination. "This ends tonight." He led her inside, his hand never leaving her arm, a silent, possessive, and utterly protective grip. Harper finally understood. The cage she had hated, the prison she had tried to escape, had been the only thing keeping her alive. And her jailer was the only man in the world who could save her. Jacob led her not to her room, but to his study. He sat her down in a large leather armchair and poured her a glass of brandy, his movements precise and controlled, a stark contrast to the barely contained fury radiating from him. "Drink it," he commanded, his voice softer now, but still laced with an underlying urgency. She took the glass, her hands still trembling, and took a sip. The fiery liquid burned a path down her throat, chasing away some of the icy chill of her fear. She looked at him as he paced the room, his body a coiled spring of lethal energy. He was making calls, his voice low and clipped, issuing a series of rapid-fire orders in a language she didn't understand. He was mobilizing his army. After a few minutes, he hung up and turned to her. The raw fury had subsided, replaced by a grim, heavy resolve. "You have questions," he stated, his eyes meeting hers. "It's time for answers." "My father," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "He told me everything, about his enemy, about why he came to you." Jacob nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "He did what he had to do to protect you." "But the debt," she pressed, needing to understand the whole truth. "Was it all a lie?" "The debt was real," he admitted. "Your father was in trouble financially, but it was a debt I could have easily forgiven or restructured. It was a pretext, a cover story." He paused, his gaze intense. "When your father came to me, he didn't just ask for money, he asked for sanctuary, for you. He knew his enemy, a man named Julian Croft, was out of prison. He knew Croft would come for you to make him suffer. Your father's plan was desperate, but it was the only one he had. He offered you to me, knowing that by making you my wife, by making you a part of my family, you would fall under my protection. An attack on you would become an attack on me. And no one," he said, his voice dropping to a low, chilling growl, "attacks what is mine." The world tilted on its axis for the second time that day. Her marriage wasn't a sale, it was a shield, a brutal, unconventional but desperate act of love from her father. "So you knew," she whispered, the pieces falling into place with a horrifying clarity. "The whole time, you knew I hated you. You knew I thought you were a monster who had bought me." "Yes," he said, his voice flat. "Why?" she asked, her voice breaking. "Why would you agree to it? Why go through all of this? The lies, the coldness. Why not just tell me?" He stopped his pacing and looked at her, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of the lonely boy from the photograph in his eyes. Because you wouldn't have believed me, he said simply. You would have seen it as another trick, another form of control. You would have fought me. You would have tried to run. And Croft would have found you. The only way to keep you safe was to keep you here, as my wife under my roof. Your hatred of me was a small price to pay for your life. He let out a long, weary sigh. And perhaps, he admitted, his voice dropping so low she had to strain to hear it. There was another reason. Your grandfather was my grandfather's best friend. He saved my family once, a long time ago. My grandfather taught me that some debts can never be fully repaid, but they must always be honored. When your father came to me, I saw it as a chance to honor that debt, to protect the granddaughter of the man who saved my family. The full weight of his confession settled over her. Every cold word, every act of indifference, every rule of her gilded cage. It had all been a lie, a carefully constructed performance designed to keep her safe. He had willingly worn the mask of a monster, enduring her hatred to honor a debt to a dead man and to protect the daughter of another. She looked at him, at this powerful, dangerous, and impossibly complex man, and the last vestiges of her hatred crumbled away, replaced by a wave of awe, gratitude, and something else, something warm and terrifyingly new, blooming in her chest. "You knew," she whispered again, her voice filled with a dawning wonder. "The whole time." He simply nodded, his dark eyes holding hers, the heavy burden of his secret finally laid bare between them. The silence in the room was no longer empty or cold. It was filled with the profound, earth-shattering weight of the truth. The confession changed everything. The walls of Harper's prison had not crumbled, they had transformed. What was once a cage was now revealed to be a fortress, and her jailer was, in fact, her guardian. The hatred that had been her constant companion, her fuel, was gone, replaced by a bewildering mix of gratitude, awe, and a dawning, terrifying attraction. Her fear, however, remained. But it was no longer a fear of Jacob. It was a shared fear, a fear for their lives, a fear of the faceless man from her nightmares, who now had a name, Julian Croft. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice quiet but steady. The trembling had stopped. A new, unfamiliar resolve was taking its place. "Now," Jacob said, his voice regaining its calm, lethal authority. "We end this. I have my men tracking Croft's movements. We will find him, and we will eliminate the threat. Permanently." "No," Harper said, surprising herself as much as him. "Not just you. We will end this." Jacob looked at her, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. "This is not your fight, Harper. My world is a dangerous one. I brought you into it to protect you, not to put you on the front lines." "You didn't bring me into it," she retorted, standing up, a new fire in her eyes. "Croft did. He made me a target. My father made me a part of this, and you made me your wife. Like it or not, this is my fight too. I am not some damsel you can lock in a tower while you go off to slay the dragon, Jacob. I will not be a passive victim in my own life." He studied her for a long moment, a slow, almost imperceptible smile touching the corners of his mouth. He was seeing the woman he had caught glimpses of, the defiant girl who had refused his hand, the intelligent mind who had devoured his library, the fierce spirit who had stood up to him. "What do you propose?" he asked, a genuine question. He was testing her, giving her an opening. "You're a strategist," she said, her mind, sharpened by weeks of studying his books, beginning to work. "You know that the best way to defeat an enemy is to understand him. I am Croft's target, his obsession. He thinks I am your weakness. Let's use that. Let's use me." For the first time since she had met him, they were not captor and captive. They were equals, partners. The dynamic in the house shifted completely. The study became their war room. Jacob, accustomed to working alone, found himself with an unlikely partner. He would bring her intelligence reports, surveillance photos, financial records, and she would pore over them, her sharp, analytical mind finding patterns and connections his men had missed. "He's not just motivated by revenge," she said one night, pointing to a series of coded bank transfers. "He's trying to rebuild his old empire. He's using the attacks on us to create chaos, to show the other families that you're vulnerable. He's not just trying to kill me, he's trying to take your throne." Jacob looked at her with a newfound respect. "You see things others don't," he admitted. They worked late into the night, fueled by coffee and a shared, intense focus. The formality between them dissolved, replaced by the easy camaraderie of soldiers in a trench. She saw the man behind the myth, the brilliant tactician, the lonely leader who carried the weight of his world on his shoulders. He saw the woman behind the fear, the resilient, intelligent, and incredibly brave partner he had never known he needed. They shared stories to stay awake. He told her about his grandfather, a man of honor who had built their family's business on a strict code of loyalty and respect. He spoke of the burden of that legacy, of the loneliness of being the ghost, a man everyone feared but no one truly knew. She told him about her mother, about her love for art and music, about her dreams of being an architect, of creating beautiful spaces that made people feel safe and happy. One night, after a grueling 18-hour day, they were slumped on the large leather sofa in his study, a map of the city spread out on the coffee table before them. They had been arguing over a potential strategy, their minds exhausted. "You're wrong," she murmured, her head lolling against the back of the sofa. "He won't expect us to move on his finances first. He'll expect a direct, physical retaliation." "It's too risky," he countered, his own voice thick with fatigue. "It exposes you." "Everything exposes me," she said, her eyes fluttering closed. "That's the point." She must have drifted off. When she woke, the first light of dawn was filtering through the windows. She was still on the sofa, but a warm, heavy blanket had been draped over her. Her head was not on the sofa cushion, but on Jacob's shoulder. His arm was wrapped securely around her, his hand resting on her waist. He was asleep, his face peaceful in repose. The hard lines of the Mafia boss softened, making him look younger, more vulnerable. She didn't move. She savored the feeling, the profound, overwhelming sense of safety she felt in his arms. This man, this monster, this guardian. He had become her sanctuary. She carefully rested her head back on his shoulder, closed her eyes, and for the first time in a long time, felt truly, completely safe. Their shared moment of peace on the sofa was a turning point. The last vestiges of their old roles, captive and captor, evaporated in the morning light. When they woke, there was no awkwardness, only a new, unspoken understanding. They were a team, and they had a war to win. Their analysis of Croft's movements revealed a pattern. He was arrogant, a man who believed he was smarter than everyone else. He was also a creature of habit. Their intelligence confirmed he would be attending a high-stakes underground poker game in 2 nights, an event where the city's most powerful and corrupt figures would be present. It was a place he felt safe, untouchable. It was the perfect place for a trap. "This is it," Jacob said, pointing to the location on the map. "My men can secure the perimeter. We can isolate him, take him out." "No," Harper said, her voice firm. "It's not enough to just eliminate him. You said it yourself. He's trying to take your throne. If you just make him disappear, it will look like a simple gangland hit. The other families will see it as a sign of weakness, of chaos. You need to do this in a way that sends a message. You need to do it with me by your side." Jacob's expression hardened. "Absolutely not. It's too dangerous. I will not use you as bait, Harper." "I'm not bait," she retorted, her eyes flashing with a fire he was coming to admire. "I'm a player in this game. Croft's obsession with me is his greatest weakness. It's the one thing that will make him reckless. If he sees me there on your arm, looking happy, looking untouchable, it will drive him insane. He won't be able to resist making a move, and when he does, you'll be ready." He stared at her, a war raging in his eyes between the cold strategist who knew she was right and the fierce protector who wanted to lock her in the deepest room of the mansion until the danger was past. "I won't be a damsel locked in a tower, Jacob," she said softly, her voice losing its hard edge. "I started this with you. I'm going to finish it with you. Trust me." Her faith in him, her willingness to stand by his side in the face of mortal danger, was a more powerful blow to his defenses than any enemy attack could ever be. The protector lost the war to the partner. "All right," he conceded, his voice rough. "But you do not leave my side. Not for a second. You are my shadow." "Is that understood?" "Perfectly," she replied. They spent the next 48 hours meticulously planning every detail. It was a complex, dangerous dance of strategy and timing. The night of the poker game, a palpable tension filled the mansion. Harper stood before the mirror, dressed in a stunning, blood-red dress that was both elegant and daring. It was a declaration of war. She was no longer the frightened girl in a borrowed white dress. She was the wife of the ghost, and she looked the part. Jacob entered the room as she was fastening a diamond earring. He stopped, his breath catching in his throat. He had seen her look beautiful before, but tonight was different. Tonight, her beauty was a weapon. It was the confidence in her posture, the fire in her eyes, the fearless set of her jaw. He walked up behind her, his eyes meeting hers in the mirror. He was wearing a dark, impeccably tailored suit, the uniform of the powerful man he was. "Are you ready?" he asked, his voice a low murmur. "I am," she said, her voice steady. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, delicate but deadly-looking knife, sheathed in thin leather. "Just in case," he said, his voice grim as he strapped it to the inside of her thigh, hidden beneath the slit of her dress. His fingers brushed against her skin, a brief electric touch that made them both freeze for a fraction of a second. He then held out his hand to her. "Don't let go," he commanded softly. She placed her hand in his. It was not a gesture of possession or of control. It was a lifeline, a partnership. They arrived at the clandestine event, a lavish, smoke-filled room in the sub-basement of a luxury hotel. The air was thick with the scent of expensive cigars, whiskey, and greed. All eyes turned to them as they entered. The ghost, who so rarely made public appearances, and the beautiful, mysterious woman on his arm. They took a seat at a private table overlooking the main poker game. Jacob's hand rested possessively on her knee, a clear, public signal. And they waited. An hour later, he arrived. Julian Croft, a handsome, charismatic man with cold, dead eyes. He saw them immediately. A flicker of rage and disbelief crossed his face as he saw Harper, looking radiant and untouchable by Jacob's side. He saw his prize, his target, not only safe but thriving. The trap was set, the bait was taken, and now the hunter was about to become the hunted. The moment Croft's eyes locked on them, the temperature in the room seemed to drop. His carefully constructed facade of charismatic charm cracked, revealing the seething, obsessive rage beneath. He saw Harper, not as a victim, but as a queen at the side of his enemy, and the sight was a poison that drove him mad. He excused himself from his companions and began to move toward their table, his path a slow, deliberate line of intimidation. Jacob's hand tightened on Harper's knee, a silent signal. "Stay calm," he murmured, his voice a low, steady anchor in the rising tension. "Let him come to us." Croft stopped at their table, a predatory smile stretching his lips, though it didn't reach his cold, dead eyes. "Jacob," he said, his voice smooth as silk but laced with venom. "I didn't expect to see you out tonight, and you've brought a guest." His gaze slid to Harper, possessive and insulting. "You look well, Harper. Marriage seems to agree with you. Though I must say I'm surprised at your choice of husband." "Croft," Jacob replied, his voice dangerously soft. "You are not welcome at this table. I suggest you move on." "Oh, I think I'll stay," Croft sneered, pulling up a chair and sitting down uninvited. He leaned forward, his eyes fixed on Harper. "You see, Harper and I have a connection. Her father and I were old business partners. I feel a certain responsibility for her well-being." The threat was clear. Harper's heart hammered against her ribs, but she met his gaze without flinching, her expression a mask of cool disdain. "My well-being is perfectly managed, thank you," she said, her voice steady. The standoff was a silent, brutal war of wills. The air crackled with unspoken violence. This was the moment. Suddenly, the lights in the room flickered and died, plunging the entire space into absolute darkness. A collective gasp went through the crowd, followed by shouts of confusion. It was the signal. In the chaos, Jacob moved with the swift, silent deadliness that had earned him his name. He stood, pulling Harper up with him, his body a shield in front of hers. "Stay behind me," he commanded in a low whisper. Gunshots erupted from the far side of the room. Jacob's men creating a diversion, drawing the attention of Croft's bodyguards. In the pandemonium of screams and shouting, Harper felt Jacob move. He was not attacking. He was pulling her away toward a service exit they had identified earlier, but Croft had anticipated it. As they reached the exit, a figure emerged from the shadows, blocking their path. It was Croft, a gun in his hand, his face a mask of triumphant fury in the dim emergency lighting. "Going somewhere?" he hissed. Jacob shoved Harper behind him, his own gun appearing in his hand as if by magic. "It's over, Croft. My men have this entire place locked down. You're not walking out of here." "Maybe not," Croft snarled, his eyes wild. "But neither are you. Not with her." He lunged, not at Jacob, but at Harper. He was faster than she expected, grabbing her arm and yanking her in front of him, using her as a human shield. The cold metal of his gun pressed against her temple. "Drop it, Ghost!" Croft screamed, his arm tightening around her throat. "Or your pretty little wife dies right here." Jacob froze, his face a mask of pure, cold rage. His eyes were locked on Harper, a silent, desperate communication passing between them. He was trapped. If he shot, he risked hitting her. If he didn't, she was dead. Harper's mind raced, adrenaline and the lessons from Jacob's strategy books surging through her. Create a diversion, do the unexpected. An enemy's focus is his weakness. Croft was focused entirely on Jacob, his grip on her tight, his attention on the man he truly wanted to destroy. He didn't see her as a threat. He saw her as a shield, a prize, a mistake. Her hand moved slowly, stealthily, down her thigh, her fingers finding the hilt of the small, sharp knife Jacob had given her. "I'm going to count to 3, Jacob," Croft yelled, his voice manic. 1. Harper took a deep, steadying breath. 2, she acted. In one swift, fluid motion, she drove the knife up and back, plunging it deep into Croft's thigh. He screamed, a high-pitched sound of shock and agony, his grip on her faltering for a single, crucial second. It was all the opening Jacob needed. A single, deafening gunshot echoed in the narrow hallway. Croft's eyes went wide, a look of stunned disbelief on his face. The gun fell from his hand, clattering to the floor. He collapsed, a dark stain spreading across his chest. The threat was over. The silence that followed was absolute. Harper stood, panting, the bloody knife still clutched in her hand. Jacob rushed to her, his hands grabbing her shoulders, his eyes frantically scanning her for any injury. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice raw with a fear she had never heard before. "Did he hurt you?" "No," she breathed, her body starting to tremble uncontrollably now that the danger was past. "We're all right." He pulled her into a desperate, crushing hug, burying his face in her hair. She could feel the frantic, relieved beating of his heart against her own. He held her, as if he was afraid she would disappear if he let go. It wasn't the embrace of a Mafia boss. It was the embrace of a man who had almost lost everything that mattered to him. The ride back to the mansion was a silent, surreal blur. The adrenaline that had coursed through Harper's veins had been replaced by a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. She stared out the window at the passing city lights, the bloody knife from the confrontation now wrapped in a handkerchief in her purse, a grim souvenir of the night she had almost died. Jacob sat beside her, not touching her. but his presence was a solid, grounding force. He hadn't said a word since they'd left the hotel, his face a grim, unreadable mask. But she could feel the tension radiating from him, the aftershocks of the violence and the fear. When they arrived at the mansion, he led her straight to his study. He poured 2 glasses of whiskey, handing one to her. "You were brave tonight, Harper," he said, his voice a low, rough murmur. He downed his own glass in one swallow. "Braver than you should have ever had to be." "I did what I had to do," she replied, her voice quiet. She looked at him, at the powerful, dangerous man who had orchestrated a war to keep her safe. "We both did." He walked to the window, staring out into the darkness, his back to her. "You could have been killed," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't hide. "When he had you, when he put that gun to your head, for the first time in my life, I was powerless. I didn't know what to do." The admission was staggering. The ghost, the man who controlled an entire city, admitting he had been helpless. "But you trusted me," she said softly. "You waited. You knew I would do something." He turned to face her, and the look in his eyes stole her breath. The cold, calculating mask was completely gone. In its place was a raw, unguarded vulnerability, a deep, aching tenderness that was directed entirely at her. "Harper," he began, his voice hoarse, as he took a step toward her. "The agreement I made with your father, it was to protect you. It was a duty, an obligation to honor a debt to my grandfather." He was in front of her now, so close she could feel the heat from his body. He reached out, his hand gently cupping her face, his thumb stroking her cheek. But somewhere along the way, he confessed, his voice dropping to a whisper, "It stopped being about duty. It stopped being about my grandfather. It stopped being about anything but you." His eyes searched hers, laying his soul bare. "Watching you in the library, seeing you stand up to me, hearing you laugh. It all became about keeping you safe, not because I had to, but because the thought of a world without you in it was unbearable." He took a shaky breath. "I fell in love with you, Harper. I don't know when, and I don't know how, but it's the only truth I have left." Tears welled in her eyes, tears not of fear or sadness, but of a profound, overwhelming joy. The last piece of the puzzle had just clicked into place. "I know," she whispered, her own voice breaking. "Because I fell in love with you too." A wave of relief so powerful it was almost painful washed over his features. He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted, his voice raw. "I don't know how to love someone, how to be a husband. All I know is violence and strategy." "Then we'll learn together," she whispered, her hands coming up to frame his face. "You can teach me how to be brave, and I'll teach you how to be happy." He looked at her, at the incredible woman who had faced down his enemies, who had seen the monster he was and had chosen to love him anyway. And then he kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion or of desperation. It was a kiss of profound, soul-deep recognition. It was a kiss that sealed every promise, that healed every wound, that erased all the fear and the pain of the past few months. It was a kiss of truth, of a final, mutual, and absolute surrender. In the quiet of the study, surrounded by the books that had been their first connection, the ghost and his unlikely bride finally found their home, not in the magnificent cold mansion, but in each other. The morning after the confrontation with Croft, Harper woke up in her own bed, but the house felt entirely different. The oppressive silence she had grown accustomed to was gone, replaced by a quiet, hopeful calm. The memory of Jacob's kiss, of his confession, was a warm, glowing ember in her heart. She went downstairs to find him in the dining room, a real breakfast spread laid out on the table, not just the solitary place setting she was used to. He was already there, sipping coffee, and when he saw her, a small, genuine smile touched his lips. It was a sight that still made her heart skip a beat. "Good morning," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "Good morning," she replied, taking a seat not at the far end of the table, but in the chair right next to him. It was a small, simple act, but it was a declaration. The distance between them was gone. They ate in a comfortable silence, a shared intimacy that was both new and felt as if it had existed forever. After they finished, Jacob's expression grew more serious. "Harper," he began, turning in his chair to face her fully. "We need to talk about our arrangement." A knot of anxiety tightened in her stomach. The danger was over. The original reason for their marriage, the shield he had provided, was no longer necessary. "The threat from Croft is gone," he continued, his voice carefully neutral, the calm, strategic man she knew so well resurfacing. "The agreement I made with your father has been fulfilled. You are safe now." He slid a set of documents across the polished table toward her. Her eyes fell on the title, Petition for Annulment. Her heart sank. It was logical. It was what she should have wanted. Her freedom. The end of their sham marriage. But the sight of the official papers, the cold, legal finality of it all, felt like a betrayal of the truth they had confessed to each other just last night. "You are free to go, Harper," he said, his voice flat, his eyes not meeting hers. "If you wish. I will provide you with a generous settlement, enough to ensure that you and your father will be comfortable for the rest of your lives. You can go back to your art, you can travel, you can do whatever you want. You can have your life back." He was giving her a choice, the true freedom he had denied her from the start. He was doing the honorable thing, releasing her from the contract now that its terms were met. He was giving her an out, a chance to escape the dangerous world she had been forced into. She looked at the papers, then at him. His face was an unreadable mask, but she could see the tension in his jaw, the way his hands were clenched in his lap. He wasn't a cold businessman finalizing a deal. He was a man bracing for a heartbreak, a man so convinced he was a monster that he couldn't believe the woman he loved would willingly choose to stay in his darkness. He thought she would run. He was giving her the chance to. A slow, confident smile spread across her face. Without a word, she picked up the annulment papers. She held his gaze, her eyes full of a love and certainty that he had never seen before. And then, with a slow, deliberate tear, she ripped the documents in half, and then in half again, letting the pieces fall onto the floor between them. Jacob stared at the torn papers, then at her, his eyes wide with disbelief and a dawning, radiant hope. "I'm not going anywhere," she said softly, her voice ringing with conviction. "My life isn't back there anymore. It's here." She reached across the table and took his hand. "It's with you, Harper," he breathed, his voice thick with emotion. "You don't have to. You're free. You shouldn't be tied to this life, to me." "It's not about have to anymore, Jacob," she said, her grip on his hand tightening. "It's about want to. I want to be here, with you." He stood up, pulling her to her feet and into his arms. He held her tightly, his face buried in her hair, as if he couldn't quite believe she was real. "I don't know how to be the man you deserve," he whispered against her hair. "You already are," she replied, tilting her head back to look at him. He smiled, a genuine, breathtakingly happy smile that transformed his entire face. "In that case," he said, a playful glint in his eyes she had never seen before. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out another document, placing it on the table. "Perhaps we should sign a new contract." She looked down. It wasn't a legal document. It was a beautifully designed certificate, with their names elegantly calligraphed. It was a marriage certificate, for a renewal of vows, a real one. "A contract," he whispered, his lips close to hers, "that is meant to last forever." 3 months later, the garden of the Lancaster mansion, once a symbol of Harper's beautiful prison, was transformed. The manicured lawns were filled with hundreds of white roses, strings of fairy lights were woven through the branches of the ancient oak trees, and the air was filled not with a tense, oppressive silence, but with soft music and the sound of happy, mingling guests. It was their second wedding, but in every way that mattered, it was their first. Harper stood with her father in a small alcove, waiting to walk down the aisle. He was a different man from the broken, terrified ghost she had last seen. The fear was gone from his eyes, replaced by a healthy color and a profound, quiet joy. He was dressed in a new suit, looking proud and whole again. "You look beautiful, sweetheart," he said, his voice thick with emotion as he looked at her. She was wearing a simple but exquisitely elegant gown, one she had designed herself with Jacob's encouragement. It was a dress that spoke of her own style, her own strength. "Thank you, Dad," she said, squeezing his arm. "Thank you for being here. For being... well, I have you to thank for that," he said, his eyes shining with tears. "And him." He nodded toward the end of the aisle where Jacob was waiting. "He's a good man, Harper. Underneath it all. His grandfather would be so proud." "I know," she whispered. As the music began to play, her father walked her down the sun-dappled aisle. All their guests, a strange but peaceful mix of Jacob's business associates and Harper's small circle of friends and family, turned to watch, but Harper only had eyes for the man waiting for her. Jacob stood under a canopy of roses, and the sight of him made her heart stop. He was not the cold, intimidating ghost from the courthouse. He was just Jacob. His face, usually so controlled, was open, unguarded, and filled with an expression of such pure, unadulterated love and adoration that it took her breath away. When her father placed her hand in Jacob's, he gave his new son-in-law a look of deep, profound gratitude and respect. "Take care of my daughter," he murmured. "Always," Jacob replied, his eyes never leaving Harper's. They had written their own vows. They were not flowery or poetic. They were simple, honest, and real. "Harper," Jacob began, his voice a low, steady murmur that was for her alone. "I came into your life as a jailer, and you became my salvation. You taught me that true strength isn't about control, but about trust. You taught me that a home isn't a fortress, but a place of warmth and safety. I vow to spend the rest of my life being the man you taught me how to be. I vow to be your shield, your partner, and your home. I love you." When it was her turn, Harper looked into the eyes of the man she had once hated, the man who had become her entire world. "Jacob," she said, her voice clear and strong. "You came into my life as a monster, but you showed me the heart of a man. You taught me that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the will to fight for what you love. You gave me safety when I thought I had lost everything, and in your arms, I found a freedom I never knew existed. I vow to be your partner, your joy, and your peace. I love you." When he kissed her, the applause from their guests was a distant, happy roar. It was a kiss of pure joy, a public declaration of a love that had been forged in darkness and had found its way into the light. Later, at the reception, Jacob took the microphone. He thanked their guests for coming, and then his expression grew more serious. "Many of you have known me for a long time," he said, his voice carrying across the garden. "You know the world we operate in, but that world is changing. For the sake of my wife and for the family we plan to build, I am announcing a restructuring of my businesses. We are moving forward into more legitimate enterprises, building an empire that is safe, stable, and worthy of the Lancaster name my grandfather built." A murmur went through the crowd. It was a monumental announcement, a seismic shift in the city's underworld. Harper looked at him, her heart swelling with love and pride. She walked up to him after he finished his speech. "You did that for me?" she asked softly. He took her hand, bringing it to his lips. "I did it for us," he corrected gently. "A king needs a safe kingdom for his queen." 1 year later, the Grand Library, once Harper's solitary refuge, had become the heart of their home. The scent of old books was now mingled with the faint, sweet smell of baby powder. Harper was curled on the large leather sofa, not reading a book on military strategy, but a colorful children's story. Jacob walked in, his suit jacket gone, his tie loosened after a long day. The tired lines around his eyes vanished as he looked at the scene before him. He smiled, a soft, genuine expression that was now as natural to him as his old, intimidating mask had once been. He sat down on the edge of the sofa, leaning over to press a gentle kiss to Harper's temple, before his gaze fell on the small bundle nestled in her arms. Their son, a beautiful, healthy baby boy with his mother's bright, curious eyes and a tuft of his father's dark hair, was fast asleep, his tiny hand clutching Jacob's finger. "How are my two favorite people today?" Jacob asked, his voice a low, soft murmur, careful not to wake the baby. "Your son spent the afternoon trying to eat my paintbrushes," Harper laughed quietly. "I think we have another artist in the family." "He can be whatever he wants to be," Jacob said, his voice filled with a quiet, fierce pride. "He will have a life of choices, not obligations." They sat in a comfortable, peaceful silence, watching their son sleep. The house, once a cold, empty fortress, was now filled with a warmth and a love that had seeped into its very walls. The changes Jacob had set in motion a year ago were real. His new, legitimate businesses were thriving, and while his name still commanded respect and a healthy dose of fear in the city, it was now associated with shrewd investments and philanthropy, not just shadows and violence. Harper had flourished. Her artwork was gaining recognition, and she was overseeing a new charitable foundation funded by Jacob that provided arts education to underprivileged children. She had found her purpose, not in spite of her new life, but because of it. "The Mafia boss," she teased gently, running a hand through his hair. "Tamed by an artist and a baby." He took her hand, bringing it to his lips and kissing her palm. His eyes, once so cold and unreadable, were now filled with a deep, unwavering love as he looked at her. "The ghost," he whispered, correcting her, the name no longer a symbol of fear, but of a past they had overcome together. Finally found his home. He leaned in and kissed her, a slow, tender kiss filled with the quiet promise of 1,000 more peaceful nights just like this one. The camera pulls back, showing the three of them, the king, the queen, and their prince, safe in the heart of their kingdom. It was a new legacy, not of fear or power, but of a love that had been born from a sacrifice, a love that had turned a monster into a man, and a prison into a home.